8. It's a wonderful life. You don't go into battle to die for your country. You go into battle to make the other bastard die for his country. General George S. Patton. Emily had sat down in a pew, tired, and was playing with the baby. It seemed to respond to the rhythm that Saul was producing and was moving a hand vaguely in time. "I'm sure it's a message from someone," Emily mused, glancing up at the church's rafters. "But the poetry seems so vague. If you're going to signal someone, why wouldn't you say what you wanted to say in straightforward terms?" Peter jumped up, much to Trellaw's surprise, and slapped his forehead with quite frightening force. "Because the medium is the message." He started to pace excitedly, almost lecturing to the church's reluctant passengers. "It's like the SETI program, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, Reverend. Bit redundant in the light of all this, but still, those lads over in California aren't really looking for 'take us to your leader.' They're after the right style of medium, a powerful, focused transmission. What it actually says is probably incomprehensible anyway. That's what's happening here." "You mean that we're all being signalled by aliens?" Treloar realised as he said it that the prospect was now one that he regarded as completely plausible. This lifestyle was getting to him. No, what I mean is, it isn't the words that are important, it's the way they're being communicated." Peter snatched up his sketch, a wild chart of bouncing lines. "And I can see what the pattern is too. I hadn't thought of it in these circumstances. This is a chaos equation at work." "Chaos equation?" asked Treloar, not expecting to understand the answer. "Yes, a totally irregular pattern that takes on complex cycles of regularity, like this poetry. There's some sort of structure in there, but it's impossible to fathom totally." "That's why it seemed to be an excerpt from a much bigger body of work," exclaimed Emily. "I read that book about chaos that you lent me. A chaos equation never ceases, does it? The poem would go on forever." "The words aren't very important then." Peter triumphantly let his notebook fall onto a pew. "The rhythm's the thing, Saul." The mathematician screwed up his eyes and concentrated. "Take a look at this." Saul hummed in concentration. "I can see the equation," he rumbled, "but I have no mathematical knowledge beyond simple counting. What am I to do with it?" "Just feed in values at one end, and the values that come out at the other, use them for the number of syllables in the line, and do it quickly, eh? This isn't my field. I'm an old-fashioned typographer. I have trouble keeping this in mind." "Yes," Saul sang triumphantly, "I see." A moment. The assembled humans looked at each other, puzzled. "I have signalled back," the church explained. "I did not employ words, but simply sent a carrier wave, as it were, out with the same complicated beat." "Any reply?" Peter was looking smug. "Yes, more of the poem, and this is different. Ah, Mrs. Treloar." "Please," Emily grinned up at the rafters. "Call me Emily." "I would think that you will find this even stranger than the previous verses. It seems to be—" "Improvised!" Emily clapped her hands together. "In other words, a message." "Yes." Peter lowered the finger that he'd raised to make the same point. "My thoughts exactly." The doctor had collapsed to his knees before his former self, his eyes closed. "Oh, God, this is it," thought Ace. "It's all over. He's going to lose it and will be here forever." Hemmings strode down the Art Deco steps, guards following him. "Take them both," he commanded. "Lock them up with their companion here. His stories will serve as an inducement to them to tell us everything." "What have we got to tell you?" Ace yelled as the soldiers approached. "This isn't real, you know." "This is hell, young lady," Hemmings smiled, "and I feel that it is my duty to torture you both. Forgive my theatrics. They make me feel better about something I regard as my most unfortunate duty. Of course you have nothing to tell me. Neither did he." Hemmings gestured to the bound man. "That's why I eventually decided to gag him." Ace backed away from the group of advancing soldiers. Torture was something she didn't want to think about. She straightened, ready to kick the first one in the nads, but suddenly, as if a tiny instant had been taken away from the scene, they all set about her and she was seized. Had she been Ace, she would have demanded an instant replay, but since she was Dotty now, all she did was thrash and yell, panicked. The doctor stood up suddenly and pulled the tape from the prisoner's mouth. "Cuckoo," smiled the man, hardly wincing. "To get to where I've gone ahead," recited Saul, "you need to find the human's head. Go out to where he lays down dead, and call me in the morning." "That's horrid," Emily sighed. "Really horrid." "You mean looking for a human head?" Her husband put an arm around her shoulder. "No, the poetry. It must be from the doctor. That last line is a signature in the form of a pun. Unless he really expects morning to arrive, I think he must be talking about the dead body. Morning rather than morning." "Right," Peter nodded. "Clever, aren't you? Well, where's this body we're supposed to be after? We've only seen these two." He indicated the horizontal forms of the Doctor and Ace. "Saul, make a search," suggested Trelaw, "as you did when little Sarah Powell was lost in the marshes."
"Indeed," Saul boomed, a touch of sadness in his voice. "I was able to locate her from the faint mental activity left as a soul passes on. I shall do the same now."
Peter was surprised that he noticed as Saul's consciousness left the church. It was like a familiar smell or taste had vanished. All that was left now was brickwork, lifeless stone. Trelaw shivered. "I always feel so lonely when he does that," he explained. "It's odd not to have him here. Tell me," he turned to the Hutchingses and smiled, "are you hungry?" "Not particularly in the circumstances," Emily replied, "but I'm sure that the baby must be. It should be wailing its head off now." Trelaw looked down at the child and frowned. "I'm glad that it isn't. All I've got is some tinned food for Oxfam." Saul flew across the lunar surface, his persona flitting ghostlight from rock to rock, agitating the trace elements of the moon's atmosphere in his passing. He couldn't leave the church completely, of course, but every now and then he let the major elements of his self go exploring. He had never been beyond Earth before. Indeed, he doubted he could manage it under his own steam. In different circumstances, this would have been a great adventure. There was life here, two souls, somewhere on the lunar plain, somewhere over the low white hills, lost in the blinding earthlight. Finding them both would be difficult. It was so lonely for them. Saul could listen to the voices of distant Earth so far away. He could hear the planet's daily trivia and the panic and confusion over the explosion at Cheldon Boniface. He prayed that he and his companions would somehow be returned home. Ernest was getting old, and Saul had felt the Reverend's heart flutter and strain at least twice in this desperate journey. If he were to die, Saul didn't know what he would do without a Trelaw to guide him. There, in his musings, the formless being had nearly overlooked the life that blazed on the lunar surface like a star in the vacuum. Just a trace, a dead image of life as neurons fired and slowly blinked out in a dead brain. To Saul, it was like watching a little cluster of fireflies gradually fading, individual memories flickering away into nothing. It was a head in an astronaut's helmet, and it sat at a small distance from its original body. Blood would have gushed from the severed neck arteries, but the cold of lunar night had instantly cauterized and sealed the wounds. So who had this been? Some companion of the Doctor's, or an enemy? There were traces of association anyway. Still, how to return it to the church? It lay a good mile from the doors. Not that it would have made any difference had it been only an inch away, with only the Timewyrm's power bringing new air to the interior of the building. Saul would have to move it himself. His telekinetic abilities were barely great enough to set his own bells in motion on the Sundays when the bell ringers were ill. This was going to take some time. Inch by inch, the head began to roll across the lunar surface, the helmet gathering momentum as it headed towards the distant lights of the church. Strong hands shoved Ace, the doctor, and the prisoner into a cell, and with a thud of bolts they were left in the darkness. Only a tiny roof light illuminated the paving slabs they sat on. The third doctor looked around him, stretching his hands against each other as if unsure of his surroundings. He had not said anything else since his surreal outburst, and Ace was starting to wonder if he'd been permanently affected by his experiences. He was certainly marked. A livid red brand was visible over the neckline of the smock. The doctor seemed scarcely better. He was still shaken by his encounter with the sacrificed companions, and the darkness haunted his features. What with her own continual fight against infancy, none of them were having a good time. "Right," Ace said with as much energy as she could muster. "Let's get out of here. I don't want to be here." "Where shall we go?" asked the doctor quickly, as if this was a test and she knew the answer. "This pit thing, the real world." "And how do we avoid the Timewyrm? How do we distract it so that it doesn't know where we are?" "Don't know." That answer had always infuriated her teachers. She kind of hoped that it would infuriate the professor too. "No, you don't." The doctor raised the eyelid of the prisoner and peered into his eyes. "We wait." Ace glared at him and wished for him to die. It was a measure of her increasing descent into childhood that it took a full minute for the irony of that old curse to strike her. Hemmings walked around his desk, inspecting things. This business of infinite power could eventually send him insane. He could become infinitely corrupted, as somebody had said. Perhaps that was what motivated the god that had sent him here. Perhaps gods were only mortals, seduced and convinced by their own power. Or was that just a religious lie, something to convince mankind that it didn't really want to take on the heights of experience? All speculation as yet. He would give his captives an hour or so to talk to each other. Then he would have one of them, possibly the girl, connected to an electrical generator. No, not the girl. That would give the impression that he was doing this for reasons other than duty. Did it matter? There was nobody left to judge him. The man, then, the doctor. After a decent interval, he would have them all shot. It would be interesting to see if the captives could die in this rather baroque afterlife. The thoughts of madness had come about because Hemmings was experiencing a strange sensation of movement, as if his head were literally spinning. He flicked his wrist and drank from a glass of water that appeared there. To his irritation, the liquid was slightly warm. "Ernest," shouted Saul, returning to the church with a rush of air that ruffled the drapes, "I have found a head." "Good. Oh," murmured Emily. "Where is it?" asked Trelaw, somewhat bemused himself. "On its way," flustered Saul. "I need to ask you a few questions, Peter." "Fire away." Peter had almost laughed at the church's worried tone and the surrealistic nature of the situation. He picked up his notebook and looked to the ceiling. "If the church doors were to open, what would happen?" Peter gulped visibly. "Well, in normal circumstances, we'd be dealing with explosive decompression. We'd all die in a very messy way. However, since I doubt this structure is strong enough to remain intact against the internal pressure of air, not to mention it being full of leaks, I'd say that the oxygen envelope is being maintained by a highly advanced science around this building. So opening the doors shouldn't make any difference, I hope." "Good." The double doors of the church swung suddenly open, and the inhabitants were treated to an awe-inspiring glimpse of the bare lunar surface. Bouncing over the low hillocks, exciting a trail of low-hanging lunar dust, a spherical object was speeding towards them. "Having got the momentum going, I didn't want it to slow down," Saul explained. The object rushed towards the doors and bounced inside, leaping over the sill of the porch. Peter jumped up like the scrum half he was and intercepted the thing in midair. "Oh," he said, looking down at his prize as the doors slid shut again. "This is the head, then, is it?" He gingerly placed the helmet on a pew. The three prisoners sat silently in their cell. Ace looked between the men. They both had a look of quiet patience on their faces, as if they'd been in this situation many times before. At one point, the prisoner had attempted to start a conversation, but Ace's doctor had shushed him. He'd then adopted an expression of sulky rebellion, but had remained silent. They were both dissing Ace. In any other circumstances, it would have been a relief to hear a key was turning in the lock and to see Hemmings enter. "Very well," he smiled. "Who's first?" Nobody spoke. His finger flicked from one prisoner to the other, choosing randomly. The finger stopped at the doctor. "You, come along." "No!" cried the doctor in sudden panic, looking around the cell for some escape. "Don't take me, take her instead." For a moment, Ace thought that this was some game to distract the guards, but the doctor seemed utterly terrified. He fell to his knees and pleaded, "She's young, she'll hold out longer. It'll be more of a challenge. Please." Hemmings looked aside, embarrassed. "Yes, well, I'll take your advice, Doctor. If such betrayal adds to your mutual discomfort, I'm sure it's in my job description. Guards, take her away." Strong hands grasped Ace's limbs, and she was carried out, numb with shock. "You lying bastard!" she spat at the doctor, and began to yell at him every obscenity she could think of, which wasn't very many. As the cell door disappeared into the distance down the antiseptic corridor, she felt her mind spiraling down into the soft trap of childhood. She kicked and bit to no avail, because she'd forgotten everything she'd known about combat. Then another door closed behind her. The doctor stood, his face hard. He looked down at the third doctor, who looked ruefully back up at him, rubbing his nose. "She could be right, you know. You terrify me sometimes. I suppose you have a plan?" "Perhaps. How did this happen?" "I was meditating in my hut." The white-haired Time Lord hugged his knees and became reflective. "Trying to get through to you, as always." "You did." "Too late." "Perhaps. And I was lured off the path. Over a period of time. It took months for me to realize, months of contemplation. Something very far in the past was troubling me. Thoughts of the past enraptured me, seduced me. My own guilt was calling me." "Guilt, yes." "Do you remember the Inferno project?" "Yes, of course you do. Well, that was my first full experience of an alternate time stream. Professor Stahlman, the Brigadier, Liz, all of them were duplicated." The third doctor stared into the distance, remembering the whole adventure. "Now, I'd thought that I didn't exist in that world, or I hadn't been exiled to Earth at any rate. I thought that perhaps that had been the divergent factor, that somehow it was the lack of my presence that had led the world into fascism. Such pride." The third doctor shook his head and looked at his hands. Then he looked up at the doctor, smiling ruefully. "Pride hasn't left me in this afterlife of ours, much as I've tried to purge myself of it. I knew that there was something I was missing, some distant memory that eluded me." "Yes," muttered the doctor, "I get that feeling too. My guilt is—" "No, let me finish, old chap. This is important. I've been exploring my memories, searching for that vital piece of information that was troubling me. The truth came to me as I sat there, tired after you called me up to deal with that pickle you were in. It occurred to me that in that fascist Earth I glimpsed, there were posters of a man, their great leader. Oh, chap, it took me so long to realize. That face was one of those that I had been offered in my trial." The doctor's eyes narrowed in realization. Unseen by the third doctor, he reached out a hand to him, but then withdrew it. "Yes, I understand what you must have gone through." "Do you?" Yes, I suppose you do." At the moment I realized that, I was seized by demons, fearful creatures of the mind as the Buddha describes them. Anywhere else there'd be metaphorical illustrations of guilt or hubris. Here they can be all too real. They dragged me off. And you let them, because they were your own demons, your own nightmare. You didn't resist." "No, indeed not. I should have realized, tried to control them, but I was in such torment. They imprisoned me, or perhaps I did it myself. They left me bound and erased my little acre, before I could tell you about the cuckoo." The third doctor looked up, as if expecting an accusation, but his future self was planning, staring into space. "Inferno indeed. Very neat. I wonder how much say the Timewyrm had in structuring that alternate reality. It certainly left us vulnerable. In your meditations over the years, have you discovered any more of the machine code? Yes, the elder doctor smiled at the choice of words. A considerable amount. Have you met any of the others? Yes. The original me. Is he still looking for the daisy? Yes. But he insists it's a rose. He understands more about manipulation than any of us do, sighed the dashing Time Lord. After all, he's been here the longest. Perhaps you should listen to him. Flowers, only useful at funerals. No. Very well. What do we do now? What any rational being would do, muttered the doctor. We sing. Emily nervously pulled up the visor of the helmet. Hemmings's dead face stared back at her, eyes frozen in shock. The pallor of his skin was the only indication that the face wouldn't move at any moment. Perhaps I should deal with this, murmured Trelaw. I have had some experience with death. No, Emily shook her head grimly. If the doctor wants us to make use of this head in some way, well, I think that's my job somehow. Ace stared up in fear at Hemmings as he busied himself around the chair she was strapped to, connecting crocodile clips to her fingers and ears. She was in a cellar, a brick dungeon with dark patches of dry blood on the walls. Instruments of torture stood on all sides, from the historical atrocity of the Iron Maiden to the horror of electrically heated hot irons. Incredibly, in the midst of all this, a painting was framed on the wall, a muscular Aryan gazing proudly into the sunset, clutching a submachine gun. It's one of mine, Hemmings nodded at the picture. Do you like it? No, Ace muttered, her mouth dry with fear. Normally I'd get somebody else to do this, the Nazi smiled. But here, the difference would be purely perceptual. Why are you doing this? Pleaded Ace, a horrid squall creeping into her voice. Why do people want to bully other people? Hemmings considered the question. Because they have to, he replied. Because they enjoy it. In the end, because they can. The two doctors were concentrating, foreheads together, arms linked above them. They were singing at cross purposes, the seventh doctor improvising his chaotically metered verse, the third doctor providing an incantation of his own that added counterpoint and tonal depth. What does croon mean? Asked Emily. Peter shrugged. The rhythm was once more pounding out from Saul's rafters, and she could hear the words even more clearly this time. Ignoring the nonsense that seemed to underpin the poetry, this time there were deliberate instructions contained in the words. Emily turned to the Reverend Trelaw. I get the feeling that you're not going to like this bit, she muttered. Saul had been inspecting the head. I think, he declared, that this dead brain contains a clue. All electrical activity has not ceased. Tiny memories will still be intact. And, as you can see, Trelaw visibly jumped as the head's eyes began to blink, unsteadily in time to the beat that Saul was rebroadcasting. There is a connection to wherever the doctor has gone. Emily sighed and sat down. Saul, can we talk to it? Trelaw stared at her in horror. No, this man is dead. His soul has passed on. Ernest, Saul's voice was comforting. His soul has gone, but not as we believe it should. It is still within human grasp. Thus, in a way, you could say that he is not dead at all. Trelaw paused, considering. So far, this adventure had been almost morally stimulating. It was but rarely that the eternal conflict between good and evil could be seen in such direct terms. The shadow of the Timewyrm did not contain many shades of grey. This, however, he refused to think of it in terms of utility. Just because this offered a chance to get the doctor back. Please, Reverend, pleaded Emily. This is Ace's only chance too, and I'm not prepared to let it slip by over a point of theology. Trelaw stared at her as if he had been slapped across the face. Very well. He turned away and leant on the golden lectern. Do as you will, Saul. His voice was full of troubles. Saul sighed. We shall talk about this later. Emily, this may be a little unpleasant. No, it's okay. There isn't time for distaste. Then put your forehead close to the head in the helmet. Your power and mine will suffice. Without hesitation, Emily did so, and Saul began to beat out the by now familiar rhythm. Peter looked on proudly. This was what he loved about his wife, her practicality, her refusal to get in the way. The eyes of the head began to roll and twitch. Ace wanted to scream, to plead with Hemmings as he wandered over to the big red switch. All the fight against childishness had deserted her. She was Dotty, through and through and through, the victim, the one who bore all the guilt and evil in the world and the playground. Hemmings reached up to the switch with a weary resignation. This was, after all, the dullest of tasks. Nothing to be gained here, no information to be extracted. Indeed, he wondered at what point he would cease to torture. Perhaps not at all. Pain shot through his head, and his hand wavered above the switch. To Ace, tensed and shivering in the metal chair, this seemed to be pure malevolence. "Get on with it," she shouted. "Go on, stupid man, kill me! Go on, kill me, see if I care!" But Hemmings buckled backwards, his body jerking uncontrollably. It felt as if his mind was being pulled out of his brain. Some animal urge straightened him, and, every nerve in his ectoplasmic virtual body misfiring, he reached for the switch in final anger. He slammed it down. The doctors concentrated, singing high, complex melodies. The sounds seemed to warp space around them, the corners of their cell buckling and inverting, twisting into multidimensional impossibilities. The Timewyrm sensed something powerful and odd happening, as if the map was reinventing itself to its true strangeness. The topography was folding, stretching, curling around itself. The rest situation at any given place was now uncertain. The virus quickly sent out probes into the datascape to neutralize the more obvious disruptions, but for each it changed back, a dozen more twirled into the possibility space. This must be the doctors doing. What error had Hemmings made? Letting the doctors talk to each other should only have increased their mutual despair. The Timewyrm slammed portions of its helix form into the datascape itself, seeking to bring the memory store once more under its direct control. But there it saw the nature of the problem. The very nature of the host had changed. In computer terms, in which the Timewyrm still thought in surprising situations, the machine code, the program responsible for the actual functioning of the wetware, had been altered. The worm was no longer in absolute control. It could regain it, adjusting to the new world it was finding itself in, but it would take a while. The Time Lord had gained himself some time. Trelaw heard a cry from the recumbent form of the doctor, and, wanting to distract himself from that awful business with the head, went over to the altar to investigate. The doctor's eyes were open, and for a moment the Reverend thought that he had somehow returned to the land of the living. But it was not so. The body lay rigid, its muscles clenched into an uncomfortable arch. Trelaw peered into the doctor's eyes, hoping to see some sign of life. As he watched, the Time Lord's pupils shrunk to dots. The irises seemed to sparkle for a second, and then, to the vicar's astonishment, changed colour. The eyes that had been a beautiful blue now shone a vibrant green. The pupils rushed back to fullness, and the eyes closed with a flutter. For a moment, Trelaw had been convinced that the doctor had winked at him. Hemmings was sucked out of the datascape like a bat out of hell. He glimpsed the chaos that whirled around his passing, saw that the gardens were blossoming at high speed, that his beloved architecture was twisting and swirling into liquid bursts of energy, that his troopers were dancing and singing and tripping over. "Linford, pound!" he screamed. "Don't dance!" But they ignored his shade as it ripped through the city and was catapulted out into the void. The void, past the intercepting claws of the Timewyrm, out into grey space, through the wall, over the breach, blustered by the sweet gales of nostalgia, his senses full of roses and regrets. Further, to a point where space boiled, a raging singularity where colour and sound and motion were stripped of all meaning and reduced to a terrifying, horrifying, nameless now. Concepts were ripped asunder, names died on the bite of reality, and Hemmings, that meaningless word, fell to the destructive point and was awake. the musty smell of a church. A beautiful woman was looking into his eyes. He tried to move his arms, and found that he couldn't. In the cell, Hemmings's body exploded into an expanding ball of pixels, a burst of glittering stardust. Ace shouted out in expectation, and for a moment thought that the pain had arrived. Then she relaxed, and found that it hadn't. Power was bursting around her, and the room dissolved into light and sound. It was almost like a firework display, like a wonderful bonfire. Only little Dory was the guy. The cell was sparkling and exploding into bursts of firework glitter. In the midst of it all, a vortex formed, swirling the colours and shapes of the place into a roaring mess. The chair flew into nowhere, and Ace gulped back a shout as her senses tried to cope with the blasting nothingness around her. She shouted as the world became a roller coaster of colour. Her lips shuddered with a desperate intake of breath, and the universe changed on the exhalation. Hemmings fought down a sickening feeling of panic. "This can't last long," a choral voice was exclaiming. "Ask him where the doctor is." "Listen," the woman desperately touched his cheek. "We've saved you from wherever you were. There is no hope left for you. Please, tell us where the doctor is." "Doctor?" Hemmings croaked, feeling his throat amazingly filled with air to speak with. "In hell. My name is Rupert Hemmings. Lieutenant." His eyes fastened on the image of the woman, and he thought for the last time of his childhood, of the destiny that had been promised him. "Hail," he gasped, trying to repeat his creed one last time. And then, pushed farther than flesh would stand, his head died. The muscles slackened, and the eyes lolled, a last breath sighing from the mouth. Rupert Hemmings was gone. Emily let go of the head and burst into tears, hitting a fist impotently against Peter's chest. "Stupid, stupid," she blurted. Trelaw stepped forward, shaking his head, and began to administer the last rites. Not, he chided himself, without an accusatory tone in his voice. The Timewyrm saw Hemmings's memory depart, distantly flashing across the night, and sent a tendril to investigate it. "What happened?" the virus asked the jumbled personality as it tumbled into the void. "I failed. The doctor did something. Changed the world. I know that. Go in peace." As the Hemmings data flew into the night, the Timewyrm's claw reached out and plucked a tiny memory. The boy so long ago on his mother's lap. The darkness closed in as the worm consumed the memory, ate it, understood it, and somehow, perhaps, became saddened at the closeness and necessity of death. This conversation might have happened, it might not. It was something that the doctor imagined, at least, as he raised his head from communion with his former self. It was a good dream. "Well," smiled the third doctor, "I do believe we've done it." He clapped his future self on the back and stood up. Looking down, he discovered that his white smock had been replaced by a velvet smoking jacket and ruffled shirt. "Oh yes, what a nice thought," he grinned. "Could have made the cuffs a bit longer, but nobody's perfect, eh?" The seventh doctor didn't seem too pleased at this metamorphosis. "Come on, this zone is changing. We must be gone before she wakes." "Where are you going, old fella?" "To the pit." "Oh dear, I was hoping that you wouldn't say that." "So was I." The doctor knelt on the floor and lifted a paving slab, tossing it aside as if it was made of plastic. "Beneath the pavements there's a beach," he muttered. "Let's go for a stroll." The doctor's face was still haunted by the memory of his departed companions, but his eyes were as hard as any warrior's. Time to pay the ghosts.